All right, 2 Kings chapter 24, let's call this one another prison of their own fiction, pointing back to the end of the book of Judges, where we said that the nation had essentially locked itself in a prison of its own fiction, understanding that at two different points, the book is going to say, in those days, there was no king in Israel. Each person did what was right in their own eyes, understanding that the tribe of Benjamin decided instead of turning over a group of men who had raped a man's concubine, they tried to conceal them, essentially trying to prove themselves loyal to people who did not deserve their loyalty. And so instead of turning the men over, the tribe of Benjamin decided to go to war with the rest of Israel, a war that they eventually lost. And so at the end of that war, they were almost wiped out. And so even as the nation of Israel tried to extend an olive branch or make peace with them by finding wives for them, even their well-intentioned actions by this time in Israel were just a mess, because even though they meant well in trying to get wives for the tribe of Benjamin, they went about it by plundering and kidnapping other people, some of whom had nothing to do with the sin that Benjamin was trying to conceal. Essentially, the morality that they set up for themselves made even their well-intentioned acts shady. But that was because they had no king, right? No, because at the end of the period of the kings that we're looking at right now, it's essentially going to be the same thing. Why? Because under King Jehoiakim, whose story is going to be told in more detail in the book of Jeremiah. God is going to show us this time through Jeremiah how the kings had gotten back into the habit of rejecting wise counsel. This time at God's command, Jeremiah is going to dictate a scroll of all of his prophecies to Judah. And as that scroll is read to King Jehoiakim, he is periodically going to stop them, cut off pieces of the scroll, and throw it into the fire until the scroll is completely burned. God is going to have Jeremiah dictate the scroll again, but it is not going to prove persuasive. And so, much like Jehoiakim has tossed the first scroll aside into the fire, God is going to get rid of him, making way for King Jehoiachin, who is not going to rule for very long before he is also going to prove himself shady and get shipped off into Babylonian captivity, this time after only, I think, 3 months. And so even though he is going to have one of the shorter reigns over Judah, and that's probably going to be extremely shameful for the moment, the fact that he is willing to at least cooperate with God eventually is going to pay off for him in the next chapter. But until then, we will see the story of Zedekiah, the king who replaces him. Since the kings of Babylon, even though God has already prophesied that Judah is going to be taken off into captivity, the kings of Babylon are giving these kings an opportunity to rule reasonably within their own nation. But Zedekiah is going to be the last to get an opportunity, because he's going to mess it up too. And after he proves himself shady, the king of Babylon is going to come back, and Jeremiah is going to warn him. Much like Jehoiachin, it's best to just go ahead and give yourself up. The problem is Zedekiah has locked himself in a prison of his own fiction, in a lot of ways pointing back to a proverb that I'm pretty sure we've mentioned before, that being Proverbs 29:12, which reads from the Complete Jewish Bible, "If a ruler listens to lies, all his officials will be wicked." And that seems to be the situation that Zedekiah is in. Why? Because he's gotten into the habit of not listening to Jeremiah. Jeremiah is described as the weeping prophet because the response to his prophecies brought him a lot of grief. And just as he has been rejected by previous kings, it does not seem that he is all that well respected by Zedekiah or his circle. And so as Zedekiah begins to have a change of heart, the siege that Babylon puts on him is heavy. And as Babylon's siege seems to wear on Zedekiah, it seems that he's now willing to listen to Jeremiah, but not everybody around him is. And so now he has set up a situation where listening to Jeremiah is not the thing to do. And it points all the way back to what we saw with kings like Ahab, who surrounded themselves with so many false prophets that when he called in a Micaiah, someone who was used to telling him the truth was no longer welcomed in that environment. It's also going to point forward to Jesus' ministry when a man named Nicodemus, a Pharisee, wants to go see Jesus, but Jesus has been so ostracized by the other Pharisees that Nicodemus wants to go to Jesus at night, even though he seems quite persuaded that Jesus might be the Christ. And so likewise, Zedekiah, even though he might now be inclined to listen to Jeremiah, he is locked in a circle of friends that are not going to make that easy. And even though Jeremiah's advice is completely consistent with what we've seen happen to Jehoiachin, meaning he turned himself in, he preserved his life and the life of his family, Zedekiah is not going to find it easy to listen to Jeremiah, even though it's going to be completely clear that his advice worked out for the last king. And instead, Zedekiah is going to try to sneak out of Jerusalem past the Chaldeans, and that is going to prove to be a very tragic mistake that we'll see play out in the last chapter of 2 Kings. Helping us see how hard it can be to start taking good advice once we've gotten into the habit of rejecting it.